Well, good morning. It's Dr. Calatrello, and here we are starting a brand new unit. This unit is devoted to our study of poetry, and I like to begin it with this quote by Emily Dickinson from one of her poems. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose. I really like Dickinson's quote that comes from her poem because it suggests to me that the poet, and certainly Dickinson was a first-class poet, it suggests that the poet inhabits or dwells in a space, not a literal space, not a literal house, but a creative space, a creative dwelling that is somehow grander and wider than the writer of stories, novels, or plays. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose. And here the word fair doesn't suggest justice as if something was fair or not fair, but rather fair as in grand, eloquent, desirable. My fair lady, right? So, the writer of prose, in other words, standardized, formulaic fiction, or even literary fiction, or writers of essays. That's what prose writing is. And in prose writing, there are all those rules, right? You have to start sentences with capital letters. You have to write complete grammatical sentences, right? Remember English 101. You have to develop your ideas in paragraphs, and essays have to have titles and paragraphs and so forth. So the poet is working in a medium or with a medium within a genre that allows a lot more freedom than the writer of prose fiction. So that's what I think Dickinson is getting at. So what exactly is poetry? Well, that's an interesting question, and it depends on who you ask. But we can say this, that poetry is one of our oldest literary genres, predating history, literally prehistoric, before people were writing, in other words. Because before poems were written down, they were handed down from generation to generation via a bard. That's a good term to be familiar with. A bard is a poet or a singer whose role it was to sing or to chant a people or a nation's history. Sometimes you'll hear Shakespeare, right, referred to as the bard. Well, that's what that means. So, before there was even a written history in ancient civilizations, there was always some person in the tribe or in the society or in the culture who had that gift, right? That gift to put into language the nation's story and all of its history, the battles, the victories, the hardships, the struggle, and so forth, because it was important to that culture, right? And if you think about it, it makes sense. You need that information passed down from generation to generation. So poetry then is really a universal and rather ancient use of language. Our word in English, poetry, actually comes from the Greek word poema, which means or translates into something shaped or something that has been made. And I like that. I like the etymology or the history of language for what it reveals to us about our understanding of the words that we use. So poetry and the word poema really suggests that there's an element of artistry to the craft of poetry, doesn't it? So one way to think of poetry is as a kind of language that says more, and somehow says it maybe more intensely than does ordinary language. The poem somehow, again, through the use of language, through that skillful use and artistry, somehow is able to convey meaning for many of us in a more direct, briefer, and more intense way than, say, a writer of short stories does. Poets are able to create and shape their poems from their experience in such a way as to allow readers to participate in it, to gain a sharper awareness of their world, of what it means to be a human being. So the poem, one way to think of it is as a lens, really, a camera lens maybe, through which we can perceive ourselves, our world, and all it entails, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So that fabulous 19th century poet, Uncle Walt Whitman, writes in his epic uh, poem, Song of Myself. He asks the reader, have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and the sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the specters in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. Without going into a protracted lecture on Whitman, whom I love, I think what Whitman is saying here is that as individuals, our lives are poems, and that we are to filter all our experience through our own eyes. And he's asking us, are we courageous enough not only to look at practice reading poems literally in the shape that we're doing here, but I think he's really, in a more introspective sense, asking us to look inward into ourselves if our lives are somehow our individual poems. So I don't mean to scare you off here, but your book does a good job of giving you some tips on how to approach reading a poem for the first time, particularly if you're not used to it or if you're intimidated by it. And I think I shared in our learning unit that poetry for me was my least favorite genre when I was a student because I was intimidated by it and sort of scared of it. But I'm here to report that it's now my favorite genre for a number of reasons. Uh, but let's start with some strategies for reading the poem and for ways of maybe lessening or reducing that anxiety that some of you might have. When you read a poem, you should always read it more than one time. Okay? A good poem is not meant to be read one time and then left behind us. Okay, and in fact, if you can read a poem one time and leave it behind you, I would I would challenge you to, or I would be suspicious of the poem if you could grasp it in one reading, and if you were fully satisfied on one reading. Some of the best poems, some of my most favorite poems, are poems that I've read over and over for 30 years or so. Also, always keep a dictionary by you. And not only keep it by you, but use it. Okay, if you encounter words in a poem and you don't know them, you must look them up. Okay, and here's why. The poem as a form, as a genre, as we've discussed, is much shorter than the short stories we've been reading, much shorter than novels, much shorter than plays. So subsequently, the poet uses fewer words. And so I think we talked about compression and economy maybe in the fiction unit. That same principle applies here. Each word must carry a heavier load because there are fewer words in the poem, right? So you can't just gloss over a word and say to yourself, oh, that's a big word that I don't know, and continue reading. You've got to stop and you've got to look at that word because the word is the poet's currency. Does that make sense? It's what they use. And so the poets choose their words very, very carefully. Also, read so as you hear the sounds of the words in your mind. And one way to do that is to practice reading the poems out loud. Okay, I know it sounds goofy and you may feel awkward and embarrassed by it, but that's the way poetry is designed. Okay? The poetry, the music of language, the cadence, the rhythm, the juxtaposition of words, the sounds that come out of your mouth, the sounds that are coming out of my mouth right now, is all part of the musicality of music. So language, if you've never really thought about it, truly is a musical, has a musical quality to it. It has timbre, it has emotion, it has rhythm and pattern, pause, inflection. All of these things are all built into a poem when we read them aloud and we hear them aloud. It's one of the elements of poetry that is satisfying to people who like poetry. Another thing that we want to do as we read the poem is pay attention to the voice that we hear when we read the poem. If you remember, when we were studying fiction, we used the term narrator to refer to that voice that we hear when we're reading the story. The narrator is the person in the story who is telling us what's going on. In poetry, we don't use the term narrator. In poetry, we use the term speaker. So that's a term that you need to be familiar with. So as we read the poem, we should always listen to the voice of the speaker and ask ourselves some questions about the voice it is that we're hearing. We may or may not identify with it, but we should consider it as we read, for it represents the eyes through which the world is being perceived for us. Remember, I used that term a few slides ago, that the poem is somehow is a lens through which we're viewing the world. So we need to be thinking critically about that voice it is that we're hearing in the poem, because that voice is the one who is focusing the camera for us and looking through it. And what we are viewing and what we're experiencing as we read through the poem is the world through that voice's eyes. Okay, so does the voice seem to have a particular gender? Does it seem male? Does it seem female? Does it seem old and wise? Or does it seem young and perhaps naive and perhaps foolish? Does the voice seem educated, or does it somehow seem ignorant or stubborn and so forth? Because we're going to experience these poems, and the voices that we're going to encounter are many and varied. And so again, it's not, my point is that I don't want you to say you don't like a poem simply because you do not agree with or see the world the way the speaker does. Okay? That speaker's voice and the poem has a value. And the purpose of interacting with the poem, again, one of the purposes, is to see how others are experiencing this thing called life and what it means to be a human being. A few introductory terms the textbook points out. One is a doggerel, which is a trite or insignificant rhyming lines. And I think the example is, I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. They are rhyming lines. Is it poetry? Probably not. It doesn't communicate much except for a love of ice cream, and I guess some critics and some people might argue that it's a form of poetry. Here's another one, I before E except after C, right? Is that a poem? Is that high art? I don't know. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But that's the term that we use to refer to these kinds of insignificant, little kind of cheesy rhyming lines that we sometimes use. You probably already know what a paraphrase is. A paraphrase is just a brief prose restatement of someone else's words. And, we can read a poem and then write out in prose form our restating or our restatement of what we believe that poem to present. Anagrams is a term that you may or may not be familiar with, but they're kind of cool. Words, or an anagram is a word that is made up from the letters of other words. So here's a good example using the words. Right? We can scramble those letters, and instead of words, we get sword. So that's an anagram. A lyric is a very common kind of poem. It's usually very brief. It usually has the one speaker presented in the poem, but it's usually kind of a personal expression. The narrative is a story, so the narrative poem uh, relates a story for the reader to follow. And if that story is long, particularly long, we will refer to that as epic poetry. And think of those classics like the Iliad, the Odyssey. Think of John Milton's Paradise Lost. These are long poems. They are epic in scope and in nature. So one night, a long time ago, I was teaching English 102, and we were having this kind of discussion on poetry, and it was sort of an introductory lecture like this, but I was in a classroom. And it was kind of an embarrassing moment for me. We're talking about types of poetry, kind of like what we're doing here, and I made the observation that is brought out in your textbook about greeting cards and about the little verses that we sometimes read in the Hallmark cards. And I was a little dismissive of the Hallmark greeting cards, and I was saying, now, is this really, are these greeting cards, do they constitute poetry? I mean, are they deserving of our study and reflection? Are they sophisticated in that they are enough to stimulate our imagination, to stimulate our intellect, to stimulate our emotions and our heart? And so I was kind of I was kind of poo-pooing the Hallmark cards, and this sweet woman in the front row, she raised her hand and she said, "Dr. Calatrello, I love Hallmark cards. I collect Hallmark cards." Well, I felt like a complete heel. And I looked at her with the most caring eyes, and I responded, "I am so glad that you love Hallmark cards and that you collect them and that you find them a source of inspiration." But you guys, it was so embarrassing. I felt so bad. Um, but the popularity of greeting cards, as your text points out, it does suggest something, doesn't it? It suggests that there are occasions in life when we look to somebody else to express for us the way that we're feeling. And so that sentiment, that impulse, I think, is a genuine one, and it's one that the great Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you take my American Lit class, and I hope you do, I hope you can come to campus sometime and take a traditional class with me. I do American literature sequence, and that's really my passion. But Emerson, in his essay that is called "The Poet," he makes that point very clear, and he does it. I'm paraphrasing Emerson's ideas here, which is kind of a dangerous thought. But Emerson, in that essay, "The Poet," says that human beings, most of us at least, are really only capable of half expressing ourselves. That there are limitations to what the mere mortal can do, can express, can articulate. And so for that reason, there is the poet. And the poet is the person who fills that gap for us and expresses and is able to say for us, in substitution for us, in place of us, what our hearts know to be true and what our minds know to be true. And again, he says a lot more in that, but that's one of the points that he makes. And so I guess when I think about the popularity of greeting cards and the verses that are sometimes written inside them, when I'm at that moment where I want to dismiss them and kind of poo-poo them, I remember what Emerson says, and so they do serve a purpose. But the purpose is not. I don't think it's as what's the word I'm looking for? Eternal as the study of poetry that is more sophisticated. In other words, we want to send somebody our condolences, or we want to wish them well, or we want to wish them a happy birthday, or tell them how much we miss them. We can quickly go buy a card, open it up, and say, yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want to say. And stuff it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and drop it in the post. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so since this is sort of an introduction to poetry lecture, I thought I would conclude it by reading this marvelous little poem by Billy Collins that's called Introduction to Poetry. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk into the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.